You remember the sound first, a slow, aching groan that echoed through the valley like a sigh pulled from the ribs of the earth. The great iron gates, taller than 10 men standing shoulder to shoulder, began to move with a terrible slowness, as if the stone itself hesitated to let them go. It had been so long since they were last closed that ivy had begun to twine through the hinges, and moss clung in soft emerald carpets along the base. Birds scattered from the battlements, their wings slicing the silence. You stood among the gathered villagers, breath held, eyes wide, hearts trembling with a question that no one dared to speak aloud. Why now? The castle had always been a presence, not just of stone and shadow, but of rhythm and routine. You grew up tracing its shape against the clouds at dusk, hearing the bells that marked the hours, and watching the shimmer of torchlight dance on its ramparts at night. There were market days when the gates swung wide and caravans came rumbling in with sacks of grain, rolls of velvet, and whispers from other kingdoms. And there were festivals. Oh, the festivals when the bridge would be draped in blue banners, and music drifted like perfume into the surrounding fields. But that morning was not like the others. The air had a stillness to it, as though time itself was waiting. You noticed how even the wind held its breath, curling in uncertain spirals around the hem of your cloak. The sky was pale and overcast, not stormy, but dim in a way that made colors look drained, like watercolors left out in the rain. You held your sister's hand without thinking, fingers woven tight, as the final inch of sunlight vanished between the meeting gates. The moment the iron sealed with a dull, decisive thud, a strange quiet fell over everything. Not a silence of peace, but the kind that makes your skin prickle, the kind that carries weight, like an invisible hand, your shoulders. Even the animals seemed to feel it. The horses stamped and shivered in their harnesses. The dogs lay low to the ground, ears pressed back, eyes darting toward the high walls. Somewhere behind you, an infant began to cry, and its mother quickly hushed it, as though sound itself had become forbidden. No decree was given. No crier stepped forward with a scroll to read. No soldier explained the reason for the closure. There was just the slow withdrawal, guards returning to the walls, merchants turning their carts around, the drawbridge groaning upward until it vanished completely. You looked up at the towers and saw no faces peering down, no fluttering banners, no sign of farewell, just stone, cold, unyielding stone. You wondered, even then, if the castle had gone to sleep. That was how your grandmother once described it, long before this day, when stories still wrapped around your childhood like a warm woolen shawl. She used to speak of the castle as if it were a living thing. It breathes, she said, her eyes far away. Not the way we do, with lungs and ribs. It breathes through people, through seasons, through memory. And sometimes, when it is hurt or afraid, it closes its eyes and sleeps. You didn't understand her then, but standing in that field, with the scent of damp earth in your nose and the strange hush in your chest, you began to wonder if perhaps she had been right. As days passed, the village adjusted in the way that living things always do. The merchants built stalls closer to the outer road. The blacksmith set up a second forge beneath an awning of oak branches. Children began to draw pictures in the dust, crude shapes of gates and giants, stories sprouting like mushrooms after rain. But no one forgot. Every evening, a few villagers would walk to the edge of the moat and simply stand there, as if waiting for someone to open the shutters and wave from a tower window. You often found yourself drawn there too, feet following a path worn not by instruction but by instinct. You would sit on the same flat stone, cool beneath you, and watch the reflection of the gate in the still water below. You counted the days not in numbers, but in seasons. The fall that brought the acorns early. The winter when the frost laced the iron like lace. The spring when the swans nested for the first time in 100 years. The castle changed, subtly. Ivy climbed higher. Cracks appeared in the stone. Yet still the gates held. People began to speak of curses, of ancient oaths, of kings who feared their own blood. One tale said the queen had vanished without a trace, and the castle was mourning her. Another whispered of a sickness sealed within, not a plague of the body, but of the heart. A third claimed a mirror had been broken in the royal hall, and until all its shards were found and placed together again, no soul inside could leave. You never knew which story to believe. Maybe all of them were true in their own way. Sometimes, at night, you thought you saw lights behind the slits of the highest tower, brief flickers, as if someone were passing with a candle. Once, you even thought you heard a song, faint and trembling, carried down through the fog like a lullaby, forgotten by time. But when you mentioned it to others, they only smiled the kind of smile people wear when they do not want to be afraid. Years passed, not quickly, but with the slow surety of moss over stone. The children who once played knights and gatekeepers grew into bakers and wheelwrights. Your own hands, once small and eager, grew calloused and careful. But still, the castle remained sealed. It became a part of the landscape, not questioned, just accepted, like the shape of the hills or the bend in the river. And yet, deep inside, you never stopped wondering, never stopped walking to the edge of the moat, never stopped listening for the sound that had marked the end of something sacred, that groan of iron and sigh of stone. You dreamed of it often, waking with the echo still trembling in your bones, not with fear, but with longing, because the closing of the gate was not an ending. It was a breath held, a story paused, and somewhere in the silence that followed, a promise waited, patient, quiet, and wrapped in shadow. For the moment the gates would open again, you were not the only one who waited. There was a boy, perhaps a few winters younger than you, who took up a quiet watch beside the old bridge, long after others had stopped visiting the castle moat. He arrived each morning with a small satchel of bread and apples, and he would sit cross-legged on a smooth plank of driftwood, whittled soft by seasons of rain. His name was Lorien, though many in the village simply called him the boy at the bridge. At first, no one paid him much mind. Children are prone to fixations, to odd routines and rituals made holy by some private magic only they understand. But Lorien was different. He did not come with toys or sticks or songs. He brought a silence with him, a stillness, the kind that made birds settle near his boots and dragonflies land on his fingers without fear. The reeds near the water seemed to part slightly when he approached, as if the very landscape had grown used to him. You remember watching him from a distance on more than one occasion, the way he would tip his head as if listening for a sound just beyond human hearing, the way his eyes, large and dark like ink poured over pearl, would study the towers through the mist. He never called out, never wept, just waited. One day, curiosity carried your feet across the meadow and onto the banks where he sat. You didn't speak at first, just sat beside him, mirroring the way he tucked his legs, the way he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. The breeze was gentle that morning, curling up from the east, rustling the leaves in the hedges. The moat was smooth, silver, and the reflection of the gate shimmered faintly on its surface like a dream almost remembered. After a while, he turned to you and offered half his apple. It was small and a bit bruised, but sweet. You took it. You nodded, and then he spoke, barely louder than a whisper. She said she'd come back. You didn't ask who. The softness of his voice, the hush of the place, made questions feel like stones in a river. You only looked at him, and he understood the invitation to continue. My sister, he said. She worked in the castle. She brought linens to the queen's chamber and polished the windows in the solar tower. She told me the stories weren't just stories. She said the queen kept a mirror that showed more than your face. It showed your heart. You remember the way your skin tingled when he said it, not from fear, but from something older. That quiet thrill that runs along the spine when truth and myth begin to blur. She went inside one evening, Lorien said, voice steady, just before the gates closed. She said she wouldn't be long, that she just had to deliver a shawl. It was spring, the last day before the blossom trees bloomed. I waited for her right here, on this log. He pressed his palm against the wood and the gates. They shut before she came back. You watched the ripple of wind move across the water. Neither of you spoke for a long time. The silence between you was soft, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that knows it has nothing to prove. In that moment, the castle didn't feel like a place of fear, or punishment, or curse. It felt like a house asleep, holding someone precious inside, waiting, as you were, for something lost to return. Lorien came every day, through summer heat and winter frost, when the reeds turned golden, and when the banks were slick with mud. He grew taller, though still slim, still quiet. His hair grew longer, and sometimes he wore a scarf the same color as lavender, which he said had belonged to his sister. He brought books and flowers, and once a tiny carved bird he said she would have loved. Some villagers mocked him, some pitied him, some avoided the path to the bridge entirely. You, though, you came more often. You brought bread and warm tea in a flask, and once even a candle in a jar, though the flame kept blowing out. You never pressed him for more, never demanded he explained himself. It was enough just to sit and share the stillness. Sometimes, when clouds thickened overhead, he would tell you stories, not the grand tales of heroes and dragons, but smaller, quieter things. About a girl who sang to the geese before sunrise, about a kitchen maid who could speak with bees, about a boy who once found a silver coin in a plum and buried it under a hawthorn tree. He spoke as if the castle still lived behind the gates, as if time had not stopped, only slowed. One fog-bound evening, he showed you something wrapped in silk. It was a scrap of parchment, yellowed with age, with a delicate sprig of pressed lilac folded inside. But he said his sister had written it, and he believed it was for him. You held the note in your hands and felt something stir deep inside, a sensation like remembering something you never lived. You thought of all the doors in the castle walls, the wooden ones tucked beneath stone arches, the iron ones buried in shadows, the ones no one noticed anymore. Perhaps there was one that opened only in summer, under the right light, in the right hour. Perhaps there was still a way back. As twilight fell, you gave the paper back carefully. And you knew, as sure as the stars would rise, that his waiting was not in vain, that something ancient stirred beyond those walls, that memory and love were strong enough to echo across sealed stone and slumbering halls. And though the gates remained closed, you began to listen more closely to the wind, to watch the ripples in the water. It was still unfolding, quietly, by the bridge. The first time you saw her, she was kneeling among the nettles with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and a crown of dirt clinging to her knees. Her hands moved slowly, tenderly, as though the weeds she pulled were fragile things undeserving of haste. She didn't glance up when you passed, just hummed low under her breath, not a tune you recognized, but one that seemed older than the stone wall she tended, older than the castle itself. You slowed your step, caught by the softness of it, the way her voice melted into the hum of bees and the hush of wind in the grass. Her name was Elsha. No one knew where she had come from, not truly. Some whispered that she had once lived within the castle walls, that her eyes had seen the throne room lit with candles and the queen's footsteps brushing across polished marble. Others claimed she was a wandering herbalist, drawn to the quiet decay of forgotten places. But to you, she became something simpler and more mysterious, a keeper of what had been left behind. She made her home in a crooked little cottage just beyond the edge of the moat, where the wild roses grew thick and unruly around the doorway. The roof sagged like an old man's back, and the chimney leaned as if bowing to the sky, yet her garden was immaculate, not in the way of royal hedges and trimmed topiary, but in the way a poem is immaculate, layered, textured, full of surprise. Lavender and marigold crowded near soft beds of moss, vines twisted like cursive along driftwood fences. Every inch hummed with scent and color, like a forgotten song waking up. She spent her days tending the plants that clung to the outer stones of the castle wall. She moved with such quiet certainty that the lizards did not scurry away, and birds sometimes perched near her shoulder. You watched her sometimes from beneath the birch trees, and you never once saw her rush. She treated every leaf as if it held a secret. One day, curiosity outweighed your silence. You approached, careful not to tread on the violets that spilled like spilled ink across the footpath. She looked up, eyes pale green, rimmed with soft creases that told of years lived under sun and wind. "You're the one who waits by the moat," she said, not unkindly. "Then you'll understand," she added, and turned back to her work. You didn't ask what she meant. Instead, you crouched beside her and watched her fingers part a patch of bramble, revealing a tiny sprout tucked beneath, pale and trembling, like a secret just learning how to breathe. She smiled then, and for the first time, you noticed how the lines around her mouth curved gently, as if her whole face had been shaped by tenderness. "This one only blooms once every 7 years," she murmured, brushing soil from its stem. "It sleeps longer than most, but it always remembers." You spent the afternoon helping her prune and water, your hands growing sore, your fingernails rimmed with earth. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words felt like seeds planted deep, soft, slow to sprout, but certain to root. She told you the castle's garden had once stretched from the western tower all the way to the river bend. Orchards of plum and quince, vines heavy with grapes, groves where night-blooming flowers opened like stars. It wasn't just beauty, she said. It was balance. Every root served a purpose. The queen believed the health of her court was tied to the soil. But when the gates closed, the garden inside was left to the mercy of shadow. She could not reach it anymore. could not tend the delicate spirals of moonleaf, or trim the white roses that only opened when spoken to. So she tended what remained, the fringes, the forgotten edges, the outer stones. "I don't grow things to be seen," she said one dusk, wiping her palms on her skirt. "I grow them so they won't forget the light." And you understood. From that day on, you returned often. She taught you the names of herbs, with sounds like lullabies: rue, feverfew, lady's mantle. She showed you how to press petals between pages, and how to steep leaves into teas that carried warmth even on the coldest nights. But more than that, she taught you to notice the shape of a seed's curve, the scent of soil before rain, the way certain plants leaned toward the castle as if listening. Once, in late autumn, she pointed to a climbing vine that clung to the highest reach of the wall. "That one," she said, her voice hushed, "only climbs toward voices it remembers." You tilted your head. "Voices?" She nodded. "When the castle was open, the queen would walk these grounds. She spoke to every living thing. Her words were soft, but they sank deep. The plants listened." You began to wonder then if stone could remember footsteps, if flowers could carry grief, if vines could reach across decades in search of a voice long gone. Elsha never tried to open the gates. She never spoke of the curse, or the seal, or the whispered stories that flitted through the village like moths. But she believed in the slow work of care. She believed that tending what remained was a kind of prayer. That someday, when the time was right, the walls would know, and open not from force, but from memory. As winter neared, the air grew sharp and clean, and frost rimmed the edges of her garden like spun sugar. Still she worked, wrapping stems in cloth, burying bulbs deep beneath the earth, whispering to them in a language you never quite learned but always felt. And you too began to whisper to the roots, to the stones, to the sleeping flowers tucked into cracks in the castle wall. Because you believed now, not in the shouts of heroes or the force of kings, but in the patient tending of small things, in the quiet faith of one who gardens where no one watches. And deep in the soil, something began to stir. There is a place near the edge of the castle's outer ring, not within the gates, but close enough that the shadow of the tallest spire falls across it each evening. Most forget it exists. Even the oldest villagers rarely speak of it. But you found it by accident, one gray afternoon, while chasing the soft ringing of a wind chime made from cracked spoons and pale bits of sea glass. The sound led you beyond the fields, down a narrow path lined with elderberry and hawthorn, until you reached a small stone building nestled against a rise in the hill. It looked like nothing at all, a squat, moss-covered remnant, more ruin than refuge. But the door was intact, low and curved, with a rusted iron latch and a handle that turned with a reluctant creak. You stepped inside not because you were fearless, but because the silence there felt known to you, like a forgotten melody returning in a dream. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust floated in golden shafts of light, drifting from a single high window shaped like a teardrop. The floor was bare, except for an old rug that had faded to threads. And against the back wall stood a narrow wooden staircase, spiraling upward toward the ceiling, toward something hidden. You didn't climb that day, you only looked. You walked the perimeter slowly, letting your fingers trail the stones. The room smelled of beeswax and old parchment, and something else, too, something dry and metallic, like bellbruns and storm sky. It was only when you stepped into the center of the room that you heard it, a faint creaking above, then silence, then again, as though something shifted in the air each time you held your breath. The villagers say the bell tower hasn't rung in 100 years, that its chimes stopped the same day the castle sealed, that the ropes frayed, the iron tongue froze, and no hand has touched its wheel since. But you know better now. You know because you returned again and again, drawn not by curiosity, but by a quiet sense of belonging. Something waited in that room. Not a voice, not a ghost, but a kind of listening. You started bringing things, a cushion from home, a jar of dried petals, a small notebook where you recorded the sounds, the low thrum of wind through the tower shaft, the occasional tap of something unseen brushing against the walls, and always that faint, intermittent creak, not loud enough to frighten, but just enough to remind you that you were not alone. One day, you brought oil and cloth and polished the stair rail. You cleaned cobwebs from the corners and arranged a little bundle of lavender beneath the window. You didn't ask yourself why. You only knew it felt like preparing a room for someone returning after a very long journey. Eventually, you climbed the stairs. Each step groaned beneath your weight, but you moved slowly, carefully, one hand trailing the banister. The narrow spiral opened into a small loft just beneath the bell's massive frame. Dust clung to the beams in soft gray feathers. The bell itself was enormous, larger than a man, green with age, silent as a mountain. But it wasn't the bell that held your attention. It was the chair, simple, wooden, positioned beneath the open slats of the window that faced the castle. There was a shawl draped over its back, woven of a deep blue wool threaded with silver. A book sat on the seat, closed, its edges worn by time, and beside it, on the floor, a small basket of dried apples and a candle burned down to the wick. You stood there, heart quiet, as if the air were thick with breath you couldn't see. Whoever had sat here had not left in haste. They had intended to return. You sat in the chair once, just once. The wood was cool against your palms. From that window, you could see the castle clearly, the arched gate sealed tight, the towers softened by ivy and mist. You imagined what it must have been like to sit there when the bell still rang, to be the one who marked the hours, who rang the morning into life, who told dusk across the valley like a blanket pulled over the day. There is a story, you remember, told in hushed tones by the fire, of a bellkeeper who was in love with the queen, a quiet man, barely noticed in the court, who carried her letters to the stables and brewed her tea when she could not sleep. He never spoke of his love, for it was not the sort that sought to be returned. But when the castle grew heavy with silence, and fear bloomed like mold in the corners of the halls, he vowed to ring the bell once more, not to warn, but to remember. The story says he climbed to the top of the tower and rang the bell so hard it cracked, that the sound carried far beyond the valley into the dreams of those who had already forgotten. And when the bell split down its center, he disappeared, leaving behind only silence and the scent of apples. You do not know if it is true, but as you sit in the chair and rest your hands on the worn armrests, you feel it, that someone, long ago, loved this place deeply, that their love echoed in metal and stone, in silence and waiting, in the tender act of returning again and again to an empty room. You leave a dried flower on the windowsill when you descend, a small thing, a whisper of color. The room beneath the bell tower still stands, quiet, unclaimed, a listening place. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you hear it, not a chime, not a ring, but a breath of bronze sighing across the hills. A promise that not all things sealed are forgotten. You notice him first by the way he walks, slow, deliberate, like a man tracing the steps of a memory too large to hold all at once. His boots press gently into the moss beside the old road, leaving no prints behind. He carries a lantern in his left hand, low and steady, its flame small but constant, glowing like a last star held just above the earth. You've seen him before, though never quite close, always just beyond the hedgerow, or moving through morning mist, a figure between the light and the fog. They call him the Old Keeper, and though no one remembers what he once kept, he returns each evening at dusk, as faithful as the tide. The first time you speak, it is not with words. You are seated by the low stone wall that overlooks the dry moat, your thoughts half dreaming, your breath fogging gently in the cooling air. He passes by without glancing toward you, but he pauses just a few paces ahead, sets the lantern on the wall, and sits beside it with a quiet sigh. The silence that follows is not empty, it feels lived in, like a cottage with the windows open, a silence that has known both joy and sorrow and no longer flinches from either. The flame within the lantern flickers, reflected faintly in the old man's eyes. You steal a glance at his hands, weathered, strong, with a tremble that suggests both age and reverence. He rests one hand on the curved handle, as if afraid it might be taken from him. It is not a soldier's lantern, nor a miner's. It is too ornate, too carefully kept. Its brass edges are polished, though dented, and beneath the glass pane you spot a tiny engraving, a rose, half-bloom. "She carried it once," he says suddenly, voice like worn velvet. You look toward him, unsure if the words were meant for you. He doesn't meet your eyes. He watches the flame. "The Queen," he adds, after a moment, as if that explains everything. You wait. You've learned the rhythm of older folk, how they speak like rivers, not rushing to the end, but meandering, circling, finding their way through stones. "She never liked the torches," he says. "Too bright, too sharp, said they cast shadows that cut the wrong way. This," he taps the lantern gently, "this was her favorite. It gave a soft light, made rooms feel smaller, kinder, more like home." You picture it, the Queen, not as legend tells her, but as he remembers her, moving through a hall of polished wood, the flame casting golden circles on stone. A gentle queen, with eyes that looked for quiet, not grandeur. He doesn't tell you how he came to keep the lantern, but he tells you what it meant. "It was lit the night the gates closed," he says. "She handed it to me herself, said nothing, only looked at me. That look she had, the one that asked, 'Do you understand?' And I did. Or, I thought I did." His voice falls soft, nearly lost to the evening wind. "Then she turned, and the doors sealed behind her. The sound, I still hear it, not just stone and iron, but finality, like a breath held for too long." He shakes his head slowly, eyes glistening, not with tears, but with the weight of everything he cannot forget. Everyone speaks of the sealing as if it were punishment. But she wasn't punishing anyone. She was protecting something, or someone, maybe herself. The flame dances. He draws the lantern closer. "This light has never gone out," he whispers. "Not in storm nor frost. I've tended it every night, trimmed the wick, replaced the oil, carried it to the wall and back. Always the same path, always the same steps." You wonder if he has a home, or if the act of watching has become home enough. "I thought once," he says, "that when the right night came, the flame would change, grow brighter, rise higher, that it would call the gates open, and she would return." He lets out a breath that's more wind than sound. But maybe that's not how magic works. Maybe it's not grand or sudden. Maybe it's the quiet things, the kept promises, the flame you carry even when you know no one is looking. He offers you the lantern, not to take, but to hold. You do. It's heavier than it looks. The glass is warm against your fingers, and the light within it seems not just fire, but memory. It smells faintly of beeswax, lavender, and something you can't quite place, something like night air or the hush between bells. He watches you, not with judgment, but with a kind of curiosity, like he's wondering if the flame will say something different in your hands. It listens, he says simply, not with ears, but with light. You nod, though you don't fully understand. You hold the lantern for a moment longer, then give it back, carefully, with both hands. He accepts it like one receives a gift, gently, with thanks in the silence. The stars begin to bloom above you. The sky darkens into a soft indigo, the last light bleeding from the edges of the world. He stands, lantern in hand, and nods once more. "Keep watching," he says, and then he turns and walks the path back down toward the fields. The lantern swings slightly with each step, its glow casting a long shadow behind him. You watch until he disappears. That night, you dream of a hallway filled with warm light, of a queen walking ahead of you, her shawl trailing, the lantern in her hand throwing soft golden shapes onto the walls. She does not look back, but she does not walk away. And when you wake, you find yourself whispering into the early dawn, "She will return," because somehow the lantern's glow still flickers behind your eyes. And you believe in the light, in the waiting, in the ones who keep watch when no one else remembers. You first noticed it in early spring, when the wind carried the scent of thawed soil and the sky flickered between silver and soft blue. You had wandered farther than usual, beyond the familiar trails and rustling birches, following a stream that sang quietly beneath overhanging branches. The stream led you toward the base of the castle's western wall, the least adorned, the most forgotten. A stretch of stone, neither noble nor cursed, just gently surrendered to time. It was there, half covered in ivy and almost level with the ground, that you found the window. It was narrow and tall, shaped like a candle's flame, framed by weather-worn stone and veiled in shadows. But what made it strange was not its shape or position, but what lay, or rather, did not lie, behind it. For while all the castle's other windows shimmered with reflections, or beckoned with the mystery of what lay within, this one held nothing. No light, no shape, not even darkness, just a peculiar stillness, as though it opened onto a place outside of time, or memory, or breath. You leaned closer, expecting to see a chamber, a corridor, perhaps a sliver of furniture, long abandoned. But the window gave back no detail, only a flatness, a grayness, not of fog or shadow, but of something more absolute, a void. It did not frighten you, not exactly. It puzzled you in a way that made your fingers itch with curiosity. You knelt before it and rested your palm against the stone, as if some whisper might pass from inside to out, but it remained silent. Not the heavy silence of fear, nor the hollow silence of forgotten places. This was a silence that listened. You returned the next day, and the day after, always bringing something small, a feather, a stone shaped like an egg, a sprig of rosemary. You placed each one on the windowsill, arranging them like offerings, though you weren't sure to whom. Sometimes the wind would scatter them, sometimes they stayed for days untouched. Once you came to find them rearranged, not disturbed, not stolen, but moved delicately, as if by a hand that no longer remembered its own shape. After that, you began to speak aloud, quietly at first, as if testing the shape of your voice in the air. You told the window things you didn't tell others, not secrets, exactly, but thoughts left unspoken. How your dreams had begun to shift, filled with staircases and empty rooms. How you felt drawn to the castle, not in fear or fascination, but in a longing that had no name. How you sensed the world had tilted just slightly, and no one else had noticed. There was no reply, not in the way you might have hoped. But sometimes your words returned to you in dreams, not as echoes, but as scenes. A corridor hung with green velvet, a chair turned just slightly toward a fire that no longer burned. And then, one dusky afternoon, you saw her. Not fully, not even clearly, just a flicker, a glimmer, a pale shape that passed beyond the window, trailing something that looked like a veil or the hem of a gown. You gasped, not from fear, but from recognition. Though you could not have said who she was, only that you knew her, as if your heart had held her name in silence for years, waiting for her shadow to return. You pressed your hand to the glass, only to realize there was none. The window held no pain, no barrier, just an opening into stillness. You didn't see her again after that, but her presence lingered. You could feel it when you drew near, a hush in the grass, a gentleness in the air. You stopped bringing feathers and stones. Instead, you brought words. You recited poems you remembered from childhood. You whispered lullabies. You asked questions you never expected answered, and the window remained. Others in the village knew of it, of course. A few had passed it without notice. One child once claimed to have seen a mirror behind it, cracked and floating, suspended in a room with no floor. Another insisted she saw a clock counting backward, but most dismissed it. Just a trick of the light, they'd say, or a shadow caught in stone. You never tried to explain what it meant to you. Some things you'd come to understand were not meant to be proven, only kept. One day, during the first rain of summer, you found the window veiled with morning glories. Blue and white blossoms curled along the edges, as though the wall itself had grown tired of being seen and wanted to dream a little longer. You parted them gently, only to find a new mark beneath the stone, faint but unmistakable, a handprint, small, graceful, worn by time, as if someone had leaned there once, watching you. It should have unsettled you, but instead it filled you with quiet peace, for perhaps that was the window's secret. It did not offer answers or reveal truths. It simply connected one longing to another, to watchers across a sealed world, whispering through stone and space. Now, when you pass by, you no longer expect a vision. You bring no gifts, no questions. You only pause. You place your hand where hers might have once rested, and you listen, not with ears, but with stillness. Because some windows do not open onto rooms, they open onto hearts. And this one, even in silence, always feels a little bit open. You might never have noticed him had it not been for the rain. It was a rain that came without thunder, soft and silver. the kind that clings to your eyelashes and makes the world feel hushed and holy. You had been walking the castle's perimeter again, a ritual now, one you did not quite understand but could no longer resist. When the wind shifted and you heard the low creak of wood, like a sigh drawn through old hinges, you turned, and there he was, standing beneath the crumbled arch of what once might have been a servant's post. He wore a hooded cloak the color of dusk, so weathered it might have been woven from the fog itself. He stood still, not in hiding, but in stillness so complete that he seemed to blend with the wall behind him. Only when you met his eyes, gray, clouded, deep as forgotten wells, did you realize he had been watching you. You hesitated, uncertain whether to speak. But he nodded, a gesture so slow and gentle, it felt like the settling of dust. You stepped closer. "Do you live here?" you asked, though you knew no one was meant to. Not anymore. He tilted his head, considering the question. Then, with a voice like dry leaves brushing stone, he answered, "I wait here." "For what?" you asked. His eyes closed, just briefly, for the gates to open, or for the reason they were sealed to return. You did not know what to make of that. His tone was not bitter, nor hopeful, simply patient. You looked behind him, expecting a satchel, a staff, a bedroll, some sign of a traveler at rest, but there was nothing, only the arch, the worn stone, and a low stool smoothed from long use. "Do you know why they were sealed?" you asked. He looked toward the distant gates, though they were hidden behind walls and decades. "I did once, but the name of it has slipped from me." You waited. He did not continue. Rain traced rivulets down the stone near your feet, collecting in quiet pools. "Then why stay?" you finally asked. "Because I was told to," he said, and offered no more. There was no command in his posture, no expectation. He did not ask for company, nor try to send you away. So you stayed a little longer, watching the rain. The stillness between you was not awkward. It felt like the kind of silence, built not from absence, but from respect, as if neither of you wanted to disturb the space time had made. Over the weeks that followed, you returned often. He was always there, seated or standing, always watching, always waiting. You brought him things sometimes, bread wrapped in cloth, warm tea in a flask, once a scarf the color of lichen. He accepted them without thanks, but not unkindly. He would nod and hold the object for a long moment before placing it beside him, as if weighing not the gift but the intention it carried. You asked him once if he had family. His lips moved, forming a shape of a name he could not remember. Once, he said, "But the years here are heavy, and some memories turn to mist." He told you strange stories, but only when you didn't ask for them. Stories about the night the bells rang for no reason, echoing across empty fields. About a rose that bloomed blood-red in winter, planted by a child whose name no one could recall. About a man who tried to pry open the castle gates with a silver crowbar and vanished with the morning fog. You asked if the stories were true. He shrugged. What is truth in a place where time sleeps? Once, you brought him a map, a crude sketch of the castle's perimeter, with your notes scribbled along the margins. He looked at it for a long time. Then, almost absently, he reached out and drew a small X in a corner near the east wall. "There was once a garden there," he murmured, "full of yellow blooms. They said it hummed when the moon was full." You returned there days later. The space was wild now, overtaken by thistles and bramble. But as you walked it, the wind did hum, not a song, just a low vibration, like a memory buried under root and stone. You never asked his name again. Not because you didn't want to know, but because you sensed that even he no longer claimed it. He had become part of the castle's breath, not a prisoner, not a ghost, just someone who had settled into a role no one else remembered to fill. The keeper of a silence no one else dared to tend. One morning, in early autumn, when the air smelled of smoke and ripe apples, you arrived to find him standing, not waiting, not watching, leaving. He held the scarf you gave him, folded neatly in one hand. He met your gaze. "It's time," he said softly. "The gates won't open today, but they stirred last night. I felt it, like a sleeping creature turning in its dream." You didn't know what to say. You wanted to ask him what he would do now, where he would go, if he'd return. He must have seen the questions on your face, because he smiled, a faint, tired smile, like light seen through smoke. "I've watched long enough," he said. "Now it's someone else's turn." Then he turned, and without ceremony, walked into the mist. You waited a long while after he vanished, but he did not return. You never found the stool again. The arch still stood, but the space beneath it felt emptier somehow, not with loss, but with release. Sometimes now, when the rain falls softly and the wind is still, you go and sit there. You watch the path he once watched. You do not know what you're waiting for, only that some silences deserve a witness, and the gates, though sealed, sometimes feel a little less asleep. It was behind the castle, just past the third crumbling wall, the one with ivy so thick it looked like an emerald curtain, where you found the orchard no one had spoken of, not in stories, not in maps, not even in whispers. It was hidden beneath a veil of mossed-over arches and low branches, and you would have walked past it entirely had you not heard the faint sound of apples falling without wind. The path into it was soft, overgrown, and strangely warm, as if the trees themselves held the memory of sunlight and offered it freely to anyone who stepped beneath their canopy. There was no chill in that place, no rustle of seasons shifting, only the slow, patient breathing of roots deep in dark soil and the gentle hush of leaves that never dried nor dropped. The orchard was circular, enclosed, as though cupped in the palm of the land itself. Dozens of trees stood in quiet rows, not wild, but not tended either, something in between, as if they had once been planted with care and then left to become their truest shape. Their bark was pale and smooth, like driftwood washed clean by years. The fruit they bore was neither ripe nor unripe, but in a state of permanent readiness, red and round and glowing faintly, even in the shade. You picked one without thinking, drawn by the quiet scent of honey and old stone. The moment your fingers touched it, the orchard seemed to pause. A stillness swept through the branches, as though every leaf held its breath. The apple was cool in your hand, heavier than it looked. You bit into it. The flesh was crisp, the flavor like something remembered, not tasted, but recalled, from a dream of childhood you thought you'd forgotten. And then something shifted. Not in the orchard. It remained unchanged, still and timeless, but in you. Memories that were not yours flickered at the edge of your mind. A girl dancing in the orchard under a silver rain. A boy carving his name into bark with a blunt knife. An old woman whispering to the roots, pouring wine into the soil as though making an offering. You sat at the base of the nearest tree, dazed, the Hoffaten apple in your hand, and tried to understand, but the orchard gave no answers, only silence, broken now and then by the sound of another apple falling gently to earth. You returned the next day and the next. Each time you picked a different apple. Each time a different memory filled your mind. Fragments of people who must have once known this place. Some felt joyful, laughter around a picnic cloth, soft kisses stolen beneath low branches, songs sung out of tune but full of light. Others felt sorrowful, someone weeping with their back to a tree, a man burying something beneath a sapling at dawn, a voice calling out and receiving no reply. The orchard, you realized, was not just a place of trees, it was a place of keeping, a memory vault, a slow-growing archive of all who had loved it, feared it, or fled from it, and the apples were the keys. But what startled you most was that one day the memory that came was your own. You picked a small apple with a single golden stripe, and the taste was like chamomile and wind. In that moment, you saw yourself younger, running through grass with torn boots and a stick for a sword. You saw the orchard then, too, but hazy at the edge of your childhood. A place you had wandered into once and never found again, until now. Had it always been here? Had the castle sealed itself long before or long after that moment? You could no longer tell. You asked the orchard aloud. One evening, your voice hushed. Why are you still here, untouched? The wind moved then, low and curling, and the branches swayed, not in reply, more like a lullaby, a motion to ease you into not needing the answer. The orchard did not exist to be understood, only witnessed. In the days that followed, you noticed that no matter how many apples you took, the trees were never bare. The fruit returned with the morning. And no matter how often you came, the orchard welcomed you the same way, with warmth, with stillness, with the sense that here, time had been asked to rest. And so you rested too. Sometimes you brought a blanket and lay beneath the canopy until the stars peeked through the gaps. Sometimes you spoke to the trees, not expecting replies, but offering your voice the way others had, as a gift. Sometimes you brought others, a child with tear-streaked cheeks who had lost her way, an old man who claimed he once lived in the castle before it sealed, a woman who never said a word but left flowers at the edge of the grove. All were welcomed, all left different than they came. You understood, in your quiet way, that the orchard was a piece of the castle that had resisted the sealing. It had kept its gate open, not with iron or stone, but with memory, with sweetness, with roots. One day, as you walked the orchard's edge, you noticed a tree you did not recognize, smaller, younger, its bark still rough, its branches slender. And on one of those branches, a single apple, not red, but soft yellow, with a blush of rose. You reached for it, but hesitated. Something in you knew. This one was not ready, so you stepped back. You waited, because that, too, was part of the orchard's gift, teaching you the patience of trees, and the peace that comes from not needing to rush. And somewhere beyond the branches, beyond the wall of ivy and stone, the castle gates remained sealed. But you no longer minded, because here, in this circle of soft earth and slow time, something was still open, and that was enough. At the highest point of the castle, above the spires, where ravens circled in slow spirals, above the moss-soft roofs and the silent windows dimmed by dust, there stood a bell tower with no rope, no clapper, and no sound. It was made of pale stone, the color of old parchment, and crowned with arches open to the wind. Most never looked up to see it. Even those who had lived their lives within the castle walls seemed to forget it was there, as though the sky had claimed it long ago. You saw it first on a morning filled with silver mist, when the fog clung to every stair and the world moved slow as breath. From the courtyard below, you tilted your head, and there it was, not grand, not ornate, but lonely. And when you asked the gatekeeper, the gardener, the girl in the kitchen with flour on her hands, none of them could tell you who built the tower or why the bell had never rung. "There is no bell," one said. "There is no tower," said another, though it was clearly there. So you climbed. The steps were narrow and winding, carved from stone worn by 1,000 forgotten feet. Lichen bloomed in the cracks like pale green stars, and every window you passed framed a sky shifting gently from clouded gray to soft lavender. The air grew thinner the higher you rose, not colder but stiller, the kind of stillness that settles in ruins and long-closed rooms, where echoes have fallen asleep and time moves carefully. At the top you found it, the bell. It was indeed there, massive and unmoving, suspended in a cradle of beams darkened by age. But where the clapper should have swung, there was only space, as if the bell had been made never to speak. Dust blanketed its curves. Ivy reached through the arches, brushing the metal like a hand trying to wake it. And though you stood beside it, close enough to touch, it gave off no sound, not even the hum of hollow metal waiting. You pressed your palm to its surface. It was warm. Not the warmth of sunlight, for the morning was dim, but the warmth of something held, perhaps by memory or by sorrow. You sat beside the bell and listened, not for sound, there was none, but for what the silence held. You listened so long the wind stopped noticing you, and the birds above gave up their songs. And in that great, ringing quiet, you began to feel it, a hum deep beneath your ribs. Like the bell was not meant to ring with iron, but with the heart. Stories say the bell was forged by a smith who had lost his voice, that every strike of his hammer was a prayer for sound he would never make again. Others say it was crafted by a monk who vowed silence for 100 years, and the bell was his final gift, a bell that could only be heard by those who understood stillness. Whatever the truth, the bell had waited. You visited often, not to ring it. That would have felt like shouting at a sleeping child, but simply to be near. Each time you brought something with you, a feather found in the corridor, a sprig of rosemary from the garden, a folded scrap of music left on a windowsill. You left these offerings in the corner of the tower, and though nothing changed, you felt the bell accepted them. One evening you arrived just as the sky turned the color of fire-cooled embers. The wind carried a strange hush, and the tower felt fuller. You stepped into the chamber, expecting the same unmoving stillness. But there was someone else there. An old woman, her back curved like a branch in winter, stood before the bell. She did not turn when you entered. Her hands were pressed flat against the metal, her eyes closed. After a long time, she said softly, "I dreamed once that it rang." You moved closer, careful not to break the spell. "It wasn't sound like we know it," she said. "It was memory, not words, not notes, but moments." She opened her eyes, and they were misted with age. "Would you like to hear it?" You nodded. She stepped aside and gestured to the bell. And so, you closed your eyes and laid your hand once more upon the ancient bronze. This time it trembled, not loud, not sharp, but like something just beneath waking. And in that trembling, you felt the weight of 100 years. Lovers parting beneath the archway, a king stepping into exile, a child looking back one last time at the home she would never return to. The bell did not sing, it remembered, and you remembered with it. You opened your eyes to find the tower unchanged. The woman was gone, only your hand remained, resting on the warm, unmoving curve of the bell. You stayed until the stars crept into view, and the bell faded again into silence. But something inside you had shifted. You had not heard a sound, not truly, but you had felt a story, one too soft for speech. The next morning, you found that the people of the castle had begun to look upward, as if the tower was visible again, not just in stone, but in thought. No one rang the bell, no one asked to, but now and then a visitor would climb those stairs, quietly, and return with eyes a little wetter, hearts a little fuller. And, though the gates of the castle remained sealed, heavy, rusted, still, a new sound began to echo in its halls. The sound of shared silence, the sound of something waiting, and someone willing to wait with it. The bell remained still, but no longer silent. Long before the gates were sealed, and long after the last trumpet called the court to sleep, there was a servant in the castle who swept the same corridor every evening as the sun slipped down the slope of the western hills. You never heard her speak, you never saw her hurry. She moved with the patience of someone who had long made peace with being unnoticed. She carried a broom carved from birch and bound with silken cord, its bristles faded to a shade of dove-gray by time. Her apron was always clean, her steps were always slow. She swept not dust, but silence, and not floors, but air. Or so the stories said. Some called her the one who swept the sky. You first saw her when you had lost your way between the stairwells. The corridor bent like a ribbon of mist, unfamiliar and soft with candlelight. You'd expected no one to be there. It was the hour when the castle sighed itself to sleep. But there she was, gently brushing the broom across the flagstones, not making a sound. She didn't look up when you passed, but you turned, compelled, and watched as she moved. With each pass, the air shimmered faintly, the light stilled. A kind of hush followed her, not silence, but reverence, like the space around her remembered a melody it dared not repeat. Later, you asked the steward who she was. The sky sweeper, he murmured, not meeting your gaze. She's been here since before the doors shut. Some say she's the reason they haven't opened. But he would not explain further. So you began to watch. Each evening she traced the same path, from the southern wing to the moonlit hall, down the length of the painted passage where the portraits blinked in twilight. Her broom never wore the stone down. Her footsteps left no echo, yet those who passed through the halls the next day swore the air felt lighter, clearer, as if something invisible had been dusted away. And gradually you noticed something else. The sky changed when she passed, only slightly. A shift in hue, a cloud rearranged, stars blinked in different corners, as if her broom, brushing through air, stirred something higher, something not bound by walls or ceiling. You began to wonder, what if she wasn't sweeping the castle at all, but the sky above it? One night you followed her, not closely, from a distance that allowed the illusion to remain whole. She moved without effort, and you tiptoed through tapestries of shadow to keep her in sight. She passed a doorway, and the candles inside extinguished. She brushed beneath a window, and the moon dimmed, just for a moment. Then she turned down a corridor you did not know existed. You hesitated. The doorway yawned, like the mouth of some old story no one told anymore. The walls were smooth and colorless. The air was cold but dry, like paper long stored. You stepped through and found yourself climbing, slowly, carefully, through a narrow passage lit only by the faintest starlight slipping through unseen cracks. At the top, a door stood ajar. Beyond it, the roof of the castle stretched in stone terraces and weathered ledges, where moss grew like green velvet and owls blinked from carved gargoyle mouths. She was there, sweeping, but not the floor. She swept the air itself. Each stroke of her broom caught the dusk, and the sky rippled. Clouds dissolved like spun sugar. The stars, dulled by twilight, emerged brighter. You watched, barely breathing, as she worked not to clean, but to tend, as one tends a wound or a memory. Then she turned to you. Her eyes were not old, they were deep, like wells that had watched centuries reflect and pass. She said nothing, but she tilted her head, and you understood the question. Why are you here? You stepped forward, unsure of your answer, and then she offered you the broom. Not all at once, just the handle, gently, like a question passed in silence. You took it. It felt light in your hands, not weightless, but right. And as you brushed it through the air, you felt something lift, not dust, not mist, but sorrow, old sorrow, the kind that clung to the rafters of the heart. She nodded, pleased. You stayed until the moon climbed high, and together you swept the sky, not to clear it, but to honor its shape. You brushed the forgotten corners of the heavens. You straightened the folds of cloud. You soothed the seams between stars. And when you finished, she took the broom back with a slight bow and vanished down the stair. You tried to follow, but the passage was gone. No door, no stairs, just the roof and the wind and the moon, watching like a quiet companion. The next morning, the castle felt different. People paused in the hallways, unsure why they felt more rested, more held. A child looked up and whispered, "The stars were singing last night." You never saw her again. But sometimes, when you pass that long corridor just before dusk, you feel a change in the air, a stillness that softens the breath. You listen, and you almost hear the broom's soft whisper through sky unseen. And you wonder, perhaps, if she still sweeps, not just the corridors, but the sorrow from the spaces between. The sorrow that sealed the gates. The sorrow that may, one day, make them open again. It stood high in the western tower, wrapped in ivy and forgotten prayers, the great bronze bell veiled in silence. The kind of silence that grew over time like lichen, fed by memory and moss. It had not rung in over a century, and yet the wind still circled it, as if asking permission. You climbed the spiral stairs one dusk, drawn by something you could not name. The castle was quiet that evening, hushed in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of quiet that waits for you to notice it. The stone steps spiraled upward, worn smooth by soles that no longer walked. The walls grew narrower as you ascended, and the air turned cooler, tinged with the faintest scent of rust and wildflowers, an odd pairing that clung to the hem of the air, like something preserved from long ago. At the top, the door creaked open, not with defiance, but with age, as if relieved to see someone again. And there it was, the bell. It hung solemn and unmoved, suspended by a thick wooden beam, its body tarnished with time. The once bright inscriptions around its lip had faded into suggestion. Vines crept through the broken stonework behind it, framing it in green like a forgotten crown. You stepped toward it and paused. There was a story, wasn't there? An old tale whispered near hearths and between yawns, about the day the bell last rang, and how the sound traveled not just through the air, but through the bones of those who heard it. They said it wept, not loud, not shrill, but low and long, a sound so sorrowful it made birds fall from the sky. Not dead, only still, as if remembering something they had never lived. A sound that made the milk in the kitchens curdle, that made the castle's dogs hide beneath the tables and refuse to bark for days, and then silence. Sealed gates, sealed hearts. No one dared ring it again. But you touched it that day. Just your fingers, featherlight, along the cold bronze edge. And when you did, something stirred. Not the bell, but the air around it. A low vibration, not quite a sound. It moved through you like a breath held too long, like grief unspoken. There was no rope, just the bell, and you. You sat by it then, watching the light change. Sunset poured through the narrow windows, painting the room in amber and rose. Dust drifted like small spirits. The wind wandered in, circled the bell, then left again. You spoke to it, not in words, but in thoughts, in the quiet way one speaks to things that remember more than we do. You told it what you had seen in the castle below, the empty halls, the hushed rooms, the smiles that never reached the eyes, the way people spoke around the past, never through it. You told it about the servant who swept the sky, about the boy who painted shadows, about the prince who never returned from the garden. You asked the bell why the gates had sealed. It did not answer, but you felt its weight shift ever so slightly, not in movement, but in meaning. And then a sound, soft, not the full voice of the bell, no, just a note, a breath, a murmur. It was so gentle you nearly missed it, a tone that might have come from the rustling leaves. But no, it came from the bronze, from the depths of metal and memory. And with that single sound, a story unfolded in your mind. A wedding day, 100 years past. The princess, robed in silver lace, stood beneath the tower. The bell rang out in joy, and the people cheered, their voices rising like birds into sky. But as the bride walked toward the altar, the sound changed. The bell began to cry. No one knew why. Some said it foresaw the storm. That night, lightning struck the tower. The prince vanished in the chaos. The bride was left holding only a crown of rain, and the bell, it would not ring again until now. You placed your palm flat against its side, and this time the vibration was stronger, not loud, not sharp, but full. You closed your eyes, and for a moment you saw them, the people who once stood here, watching the sunset, just as you were now. The bellkeeper in his leather apron, the apprentice polishing the clapper with reverent hands, the old queen placing her fingers on the rim, whispering wishes into the bronze. You were not the first to ask the bell for its story, but perhaps you were the first to listen gently enough to hear its echo. As darkness fell, you rose. You did not ring it. You simply bowed, the way one does before a monument or a memory too large to hold. And as you descended the spiral steps, you felt something following, not a presence, but a permission. The bell had remembered, and perhaps it had forgiven. In the days that followed, the air in the castle changed. Not everyone noticed, but the musicians tuned their lutes with softer hands. The bakers left their windows open. The doves returned to the eaves of the western wing. And one night, someone claimed they heard a bell, just once, far in the distance. No one found proof, but everyone slept more deeply that night, as if something high above had finally exhaled, as if the great silence had sighed and loosened its grip on the gates. Just a little. You were not searching for anything in particular when you found it. That was often how such things began within the castle, by accident, or instinct, or a quiet pull from somewhere below conscious thought. The corridors had twisted strangely that morning, folding in ways you could not remember from the day before. The sun, although high, did not warm the stone, and the light that filtered through the arched windows came in slanted and blue. You passed tapestries that seemed older than the castle itself, threads dulled to the color of winter ash. At a bend in the hallway, you noticed a doorway that hadn't been there yesterday. Not hidden, not locked, simply unnoticed. It had no markings, no rusted handle or keyhole. Only a smooth wooden face, stained the color of pressed violets and cool to the touch. The moment you opened it, you felt something change. The room inside was round, perfectly round. Not circular in a way that still bowed to architecture, but round like a stone rolled smooth by the ocean. There were no corners, no angles, no boundaries that told your eyes where the edges ended. You stepped inside, and the air welcomed you. It was warm, not heavy, not humid, but soft and steady, like breath. And there was a scent, subtle and strange, something like beeswax, like pressed paper, like wood that had been carved but never burned. A scent that spoke of memory. There were no windows, yet the room was lit, not by flame or candle, but by a light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, soft, pale, like the last light of dusk on a quiet lake. In the center stood a pedestal, low and wide, made of the same seamless stone as the floor. Upon it lay a book. You approached slowly, uncertain if you should be here, uncertain if this was meant for you. The book did not look magical or ornate. Its cover was unadorned, bound in a soft gray hide, worn at the edges. There was no title. They did not flutter or crinkle, they whispered. Not in voices, but in sensation. You could almost feel what had been written before your eyes read it. The ink was a deep blue-black, each word drawn by hand, precise and careful. The letters were familiar, but not modern, rounded and old, as if carved rather than written. The book told stories, not stories you had read before, but stories you somehow remembered, tales of things you had not seen, yet had dreamed. A child who turned to stone beneath the moon, a bell that rang once every 100 winters, a creature made of light that wept only when someone forgot it. There were no chapters, no titles, only one long flowing account, like a river, winding gently onward through time. As you read, the room changed, not physically, but in mood. The air grew quieter, deeper. You felt, suddenly, that you were being watched, not with eyes, but with awareness. The room knew you were here. The book welcomed your presence. And something beneath the surface, something older than the walls, was listening. You turned the page. Another story. This one about a girl who spoke the language of crows and was buried in feathers when she died. A boy who spent his entire life building a clock, only to discover, in the end, that it was never meant to tell time, but to keep it still. You paused, your fingers resting on the smooth parchment. On the next page, you saw something different. A drawing, just a faint sketch in pale ink. The gates, your gates, closed, just as they had been for 100 years. But around them, vines had grown, winding up the bars like fingers. And in the corner of the page, almost hidden, was a figure. You knew it without question. You closed the book gently. It did not resist. The silence in the room was full now, not empty, not lonely, but filled with meaning. As if every breath you took belonged not only to you, but to the room itself. You wondered who had written the book, if it was still being written. You stepped back. The pedestal remained still. The book stayed closed, but somehow you knew it would open again. And the next reader, if they were quiet enough, still enough, would see something entirely different, not new, but meant only for them. As you moved toward the doorway, you realized you had not blinked in some time. Your eyes had adjusted to the glow, your ears to the silence. The castle's usual sounds, the creak of beams, the sigh of old curtains felt distant now, far away. You turned, meaning to mark it, to remember where it was, but it had vanished. No wood, no seam, no sign of its ever being there. Only a cool patch of wall, smooth and violet dark. You pressed your palm to it, and for a moment the air behind the stone seemed to exhale, as if the room had let you go, as if it had finished showing you what you needed to see. You walked on, and as you moved down the hall, something in you had shifted. You would not speak of it aloud. Not yet. But the stories from the book stayed with you. Their rhythm matched your steps. Their scent lingered on your fingertips. Their truths settled in your chest like soft rain in dry soil. And somewhere deep in the castle's belly, another page turned. There was a day when the wind would not rise, no matter how wide the windows stood, no matter how long the hallways stretched. The castle lay still, as if holding its breath. You noticed it first in the way your footsteps echoed longer than they should, and how the candle flames bent, not with breeze, but with something quieter, something more inward, like the hush of listening. It was then that you found the stairs again. You had passed them many times before, in the northwestern wing, where the stone had darkened with age, and ivy curled through the broken teeth of high archways. But that morning the light fell differently. A crack in the ceiling let in a narrow thread of gold that slid across the floor like a finger, pointing. It stopped at the top step, and so you followed it. The staircase was narrow and round, coiled like a sleeping serpent. The steps worn shallow in the middle, as if shaped by the passage of countless feet long since vanished. You held the wall with one hand and felt the chill in the stone damp, not cold, like something that had been waiting far from sunlight. The torches had not been lit in years, but you did not bring one. The air itself seemed to glow faintly, enough for you to see the way. You descended slowly, step by step, your breath soft, your body swaying slightly with the curve. At first, you counted 12, 30, 45, but soon the numbers drifted away, lost in the rhythm of descent. You no longer knew how long you'd been walking, only that your legs ached in a way that felt not painful but earned, as if with each step you moved deeper into something forgotten. The stone around you shifted subtly the farther you went. The gray became bluer, veined with shimmering lines like frost trapped inside rock. You touched one and felt a hum distant, low, like a bell rung underwater. The air grew heavier, not suffocating, but thick with memory. You could taste it on your tongue, old dust, salt, and something sweeter, like lavender, burned to ash. Eventually, the stair ended, not abruptly, but like the last note of a lullaby fading complete. You stepped onto a floor that was not stone, but something softer, smoother, like glass or still water. The space around you was vast, round again, echoing the curve of the staircase above. a dome of silence. You were not alone. They did not look up when you arrived. There were 9 of them, seated in a circle, each facing inward, eyes closed. Their robes were pale gray, heavy with threadbare embroidery. On their heads rested thin crowns of woven branches, brittle and dry. Their hands were open on their laps, palms up, as though still waiting for something to be placed within. They did not move, not when you stepped closer, not when your breath caught, not even when you whispered. You looked into their faces and saw not sleep, but stillness, not death, but something older, something between waiting and remembering. Their skin was lined like cracked parchment. Their mouths were slack with peace. You had no name for them, but they felt familiar, as if they had once stood at the edge of a decision that shaped the world above. In the center of the circle, resting on a low pedestal of black stone, sat a sealed jar. It was small, glass, wrapped in iron bands. Inside it, mist, pale, constantly shifting. Not smoke, not fog, but something in between, a memory made visible. You leaned closer and saw images flickering inside. But this time, from the other side, there were shadows there, and shapes. Something had tried to come through once, not with noise or war, but with silence. A silence that crept like ivy and settled like dust. The jar held it still. You understood then. The jar was the reason the gates had been sealed. The silence beyond them had not been emptiness, but a presence, a kind of forgetting that spread soft as velvet until even names and dreams dissolved. It had reached the castle once, long ago. And these 9, whoever they had been, had brought it down here, sealed it, surrounded it with themselves, and remained. You did not know how long they had kept their vigil. 100 years, perhaps more, but it had worked. The silence had not returned until now, because the jar pulsed, not violently, just once, a slow ripple, like breath held too long, a suggestion. And you, standing there, had felt it answer something inside you. Not a call, a remembering. You reached out. Your fingers hovered over the iron bands. The mist inside curled in your direction, sensing you, recognizing you, perhaps. You did not touch it. You simply stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle into your bones. The air stirred, only slightly. One of the 9 shifted a breath, a twitch, a murmur. Their eyes did not open, but you felt their awareness rejoin the room. The vigil was not ended, only noticed. You stepped back, you bowed, quietly, as if before something sacred, and you left. The stairs were longer on the way up, heavier, not in distance, but in meaning. You carried something now, the silence itself, not the mist, but the memory of it. And memories, as you'd come to learn, were often the strongest things of all. When you emerged back into the hallway, the sun had moved. The light was warmer now, brushing the stones with gold, and a faint wind moved through the window slits. The castle was breathing again. You walked on, and behind you, far beneath the floors and walls and stories, the 9 kept their circle, unbroken. The jar remained sealed. You would not have found it in the day. Not because it was hidden. There were no locked doors, no secret mechanisms or enchanted veils, but because the garden was not meant for daylight. It waited, quietly, until the moon returned, until silver replaced gold, until the world grew hushed enough to remember the shape of forgotten blossoms. You had walked past it dozens of times, thinking it a dead end, a wall of bramble and tangled root. But one night, when the moon hung low and heavy like a polished coin, the way opened. There was no sound, only stillness. The garden stretched far and round, shaped like the full moon itself. The paths were made of crushed bone-white shell, soft beneath your feet. And in every bed, along every winding edge, bloomed flowers you had never seen before. They shimmered faintly, not with color, but with memory. A soft yellow that stirred the warmth of childhood hands clasping yours. A deep, unknowable blue that tasted like the sea, like sorrow that didn't hurt. And overhead, the moon glowed brighter than it ever had above the castle. It seemed closer here, more present, as if watching. Each breath carried a whisper of someone who had walked this garden long before you. There were benches of marble, long weathered, where moss had grown in gentle curls. You sat on one, eventually, not out of fatigue, but out of reverence, the way one sits before a fire, not for warmth, but for listening. From where you sat, you could see a tree at the center of the garden. They pulsed with a light that was not light, a knowing. You rose and walked toward it, slowly. The ground shifted beneath you, not in tremble, but in memory, as if the garden was remembering your steps from another time. Pure moonlight, stilled into liquid, rippling, even though the air was calm. You looked into it and saw not your reflection, but something else, the castle, as it had been, before the gates were sealed. There were children laughing on the parapets, knights without armor, sharing stories by the fire. You saw lives lived without shadow, days that passed like soft pages turned by a steady hand. But then the moonlight darkened, and the image changed. You saw the silence coming, not fast, not cruel, but steady, like fog over a hill, like dusk settling into bones. It crept, not to attack, but to erase names, faces, songs, dreams. It softened everything into nothing. And one by one, the rooms emptied, the doors closed, the light retreated, and the garden bloomed. A place where the moon could keep watch, and the flowers could hold the stories that would have otherwise been lost. You reached into the basin not with your hand, but with your gaze, and you felt a pulse of recognition. The garden knew you. It did not speak, but it offered, not answers, but remembrance. And in that moment, you understood what the gates had truly been keeping out. Not an enemy, not a force, but forgetting. The kind that slips in through ordinary days, that dulls the edges of joy, that makes you forget why songs mattered, or why your grandmother's hands felt like safety, or why the smell of rosemary makes your chest ache. You had been sealed in to protect the shape of memory, and now the garden was opening again, because the time was near. The flowers stirred, the moonlight brightened, and when you stepped back through the birch arch into the rest of the castle, the night did not feel quite as dark. You carried the scent with you, the hush, the softness of the blossoms, and somewhere deep inside, a blossom of your own had begun to open, quietly, gently, remembering.